Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this video is going to be my API call masterclass. The goal of this video is to kind of make you really comfortable with making API calls and showing you how to kind of set up a good way to practice making API calls. So what I want you to first do is we're going to create a Netlify function that's going to be sort of like our punching bag per se. So if you're practicing boxing, you have a punching bag and you practice your punching there. We're going to create a function that's going to act as our punching bag, a place to just kind of practice. And if you're not familiar with what Netlify functions are, it's a really cool feature. I have other videos on that, so I would recommend watching that, but this template here will get you started pretty easily. Okay, so basically what you're going to do is I'm going to put this URL in the video description. And all you're going to do is you're going to go here and you're going to fork this repo to your GitHub account. And essentially what this is just a template that has the shell with everything kind of already set up for you to build Netlify functions. Now there's already one function in there, and basically the way you build Netlify functions is that in your project you have a folder called Netlify, and in there a folder called functions, and there you can build out your functions. But this practice function is just basically a little mini API that'll just deliver your request back to you, so we can just make different types of requests and kind of see what it says. So that's already set, so you don't have to do any editing of this code. If you do want to play around with the function, play around with it, like here's some details, but that's not the point. So fork this repo. Okay, and then we're going to head over to Netlify. So if you haven't used netlify.com, go set up a Netlify account. It's an amazing service. Head over to new site from Git once you log into your dashboard, and we'll click on GitHub, and then you might have to connect your GitHub account if it hasn't already been connected to your account. And I will search up that repo, Netlify, and wait for that to pop up, and here it is, Netlify functions template. Then I will deploy the site. You don't have to change any of the settings. And then we'll scroll down. We can click here where it says production to see the build. Should be pretty quick, since there's not really much of a site there. What I really care about is just making sure that the function got built. So now I see this. The function was built, so that means it'll be available to us to play around with. Good. Okay, so now that that's done, I can go here. And to find more information about the function we just deployed, you go over here to functions. And see, there's our practice function. We'll click on that. And this is all we really wanted. We just want to get this URL. Okay? So with that, we can use that as our practice. So now I'm going to go to VS Code. I'm going to create a new file. And we're going to call this, actually I'm going to call this practice.html. So why am I making an HTML file? The reason is I want to open it up in the browser, but I'm not going to make a separate JavaScript file because we're just practicing API calls. So I'm going to use Inline Javascript. So I want to set up my boilerplate, use the exclamation point, set up the boilerplate. I'm going to put a script tag in the body. Why didn't it give me a closing script tag? Oh well. /script. Okay. And now that we have a script tag in place, what I can do is I can write JavaScript in the middle of these script tags. Okay. So I'm gonna just first write this URL, put this URL here, comment it out so that we have access to it. And now let's go through the lesson. Okay, making an API call. So what I want to do is show you not just how to make a simple GET request, but also how to do like more complicated requests in this video, and just to show you like how you would add different parts and kind of see that response. So what I'm going to do first is we're going to use Jquery and use the Ajax function. So code.jquery.com. This is where we get the script tag for Jquery. Now, if I go here, I'm going to go to uncompressed, use script, and then I'm going to put that script tag in my head so that way I have access to Jquery. Okay, cool. And the Jquery function is really just this $sign. Okay, so once you have Jquery loaded up, this $sign takes on new life. So what I can do is after the $sign has a function called Ajax. And we can use this to make an API call. The simplest way to do it is you just pass the URL. So I'm going to just pass it a URL. And what this does is by default, it makes what's called a GET request to that URL. Okay? And it then returns a promise. I watch my promise masterclass video if you want to understand more about promises. But the basic idea is that that's how all these functions work. They return a promise, and anything that returns a promise to do the thing you want to do when that promise is finished is you have to do a .then function. Okay? So I'm going to say the idea is that the .then receives the successful promise. So basically that promise is going to give me back my data from the API call. So this URL will give back some data of some sort. And in this function that I'm defining here inside the .then, I'm able to use .data. Okay, so let's see here. Now, well, all we want to do is really just console.log the data. That's all we care about. And that's it. Now, if I really wanted to, in case I was worried about an error, I have two choices. I could either pass a second function to the .then in case there's an error, or I could do a .catch and just pass that second function there and just say, hey, an error will get passed to this function, and I would like to console.log that error in the situation where that error happens. I'm not too worried about that. So let's right click. And another little thing I like to do is just make it say error. So that way it's a little bit more clear in the console what's going on there. Okay. Cool. So I'm going to right click on this HTML file and open it with Live Server. So that way it pops up in the browser. Again, there's nothing on the screen, so it's all going to be in the terminal. Oh, and look. There is an error. Okay. See, I get error object. Okay. And the reason I'm getting this error is because I'm getting what's called a CORS error. Okay, and that's going to happen. Now, CORS errors, and so you notice how, like, because of the CORS error, it went and ran the catch block, and see it console log the error, which has all the details of the error. So that's the beauty of the catch block and the beauty of handling errors. Now, the problem here is when you see a CORS error, it's telling you that whoever created the API, in this case me, because I created the function, didn't allow other people from other websites to make the API call. So I could make the API call in the browser. So if I open up a separate browser tab and put this URL, see, I'll get the data back because this is not another website. This is just Chrome doing it. I could also use software like Postman, make the API call successfully. But the CORS issue comes up when it's another website. So when it sees like 127.0, it thinks this is a website, which technically it is. And Google, or really all the browsers, they say, okay, one website cannot make a request to another website without permission. So that API has to have these headers. Okay, see these headers here, access, control, allow, origin. So if you open up that code, so let me open up a separate window. A new window, and let me open up that code. Okay, Netlify functions. Close all this stuff. So if you go to that API that you forked, or like that Netlify functions repo you forked, we go to the function. Notice I have all those headers commented out. Okay, so me, the person who's making the API, I'm not giving permission for other people to make other websites to make a request to my API. So I need to fix this in order for this to work. So I'm going to just comment these out. This asterisk means everything. So all websites can make a request. They can make a request of any method. They can use any header. Okay. For security purposes, like on a production website, you'd want to specify like which actual domains can make a request to your API. Can they make like get and put and post requests? What headers they're allowed to send over. But in this case, we're just going to allow everything. We're not going to worry about it. Okay. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to push that up to GitHub. Origin. And don't worry about the command that I'm pushing. See, I'm using this pushy command. That's a custom command that I made on my computer. You would have to do the git push add, the git push commit, the git push to GitHub. You have to do all that. I've created a little shortcut for myself. So just so you're aware, don't try to just do this pushy command at home. Bushy update. If you want to know how to do that, watch my bash terminal bash scripting video. I go over how you do that. Okay, pushy update origin master. Nope, actually origin main. Oh wait, what? Oh no, this is the wrong folder. So let me right click in the right folder, right click, open in terminal. There we go. Okay, so that API will redeploy itself. Let's just go double check that it does. So I go back to Netlify. I'm gonna go back to this main page. See, it's building, so I'm waiting for that to finish. Good. Okay, it's finished. Now let's go back to our test website, and I'm gonna refresh. And see, now we get a successful API call because those CORS headers are on the. Now this always gets a little frustrating when you're using like a third-party website. Because when you're using a third-party website, you can't control what headers they have on their API. You could use Netlify functions as a workaround, so I'll come back to that at the very end of the video. So first let's talk about making API calls. Then we'll talk about how maybe you can use a Netlify function to deal with a CORS error. Okay, but see, like, what we get back is just essentially what we sent. We didn't send over any body. We'll talk about sending bodies over in a moment. These are just all the default headers that the browser naturally sends over. We'll show you about sending our own custom headers, because sometimes you have to send your own custom headers. This is the method. Again, by default, if we didn't specify, it's always going to make a GET request. This is the path. This is where we made a request to. And these were any query string parameters. Okay, and so we'll talk about what each of these things are throughout this video. Let's talk about query string parameters first. A query string always starts at the end of the URL. So if I want to add a query, I have to add a question mark at the end of the URL, and then I can say whatever I want. Cheese equals Gouda. And then if I want to add another query, I use an ampersand. And we'll say bread equals rye. Okay, and now this is the query string. It could be anything I want. Okay, for example, if you go to YouTube, like if we head over to YouTube, and I just choose a random video, let's see here. Okay, let's choose this video about WandaVision. Let me just pause it. There we go. Take a look at the URL. See, every YouTube video you watch is the same URL. It's always youtube.com/watch. The way it knows what video it is that it's using the query string. The V stands for video. Okay, now how do you know that V stands for video? You don't. This is something that Google programmed and designed in their API, and it works. Every API is different, you know. So watch, and then basically this is the ID number of the video. So that's how YouTube works. It actually uses query strings to know which video it wants. Instead of creating like millions and millions of URLs, it has one URL, and it uses query strings to figure out which video it wants to load up. Okay, and if you haven't been watching WandaVision, you should be watching WandaVision. And if this is years later, then you should still probably go back and watch all the MCU stuff. Okay, but now if I go back, and I'm going to refresh this, I go to query string parameters, see, it parses the query string. And I get back an object with, you know, bread equals rye, and cheese equals Gouda. So whoever's making the API can get this object back from your query and do stuff with it. So YouTube would get the video URL back from their API, and then they would be able to query their database for that particular video. Okay, but you can see like that's the purpose of the query string. It's just determining what are the keys and values in that query string object that comes back during the API call. Okay, notice that doesn't show up in headers, it doesn't show up in body. Okay, and even though I'm sending bread and cheese, it does nothing. Okay, again, every API is designed to expect certain queries, so that's why you always have to read the documentation of any API you're using to know like what does it expect. Okay, I just built this to just send you back whatever you send in. Okay, again, this is merely a learning tool. Now, let's talk about like the headers and all that stuff, okay? So what if I wanted to send over a header? Well, this doesn't work because this by default sends a GET request, and by default doesn't let me specify any other properties. So to do that, I have to alter this. So instead of passing just the string, you have to pass an object. Okay, we pass an object, and then here we can pass the URL that we're making a request to. Okay, and this is just how this particular function works. There we go. And then now I can specify things like headers. Now headers is always a separate object because there are endless amounts of headers you might possibly want to send over. Now typically what's going to happen is that you might want to send over what's called an authorization header, and they can come in a bajillion different flavors. So again, you have to read documentation for whatever API you're using or whatever set you're using, but it would usually be something like this, like it's the word authorization, and then you might have to put the word bearer, space, and then some token that you got from somewhere. Okay, and then so that's one header. Okay, and then maybe you have to send some other header. Another popular header is content type. This is generally telling the browser what kind of data you're sending over. So I might want to say, hey, I'm sending over JSON data, application JSON. Okay. Then I might want to send over a body. Okay. I forget if I think in Ajax they want you to send it over as data, the body. So we'll test that out. Hello world. It's just another object. And actually, here's the thing. If we're sending over JSON data, we have to turn it into JSON. So we have to use this function called Json.Stringify that takes a object and turns it to JSON. So then I'll pass that the data, and we'll say hello world. Okay, so I'm passing in this object that has hello world. Json.Stringify turns that into a JSON string, and that becomes the value of this data property. So let's take a look. So now if I go into my headers, no, still no body. Okay, so we'll come, well, let me refresh. Okay, still no body, so we'll have to come back and address that. Oh, but it's because I'm making a GET request still. If I go to headers, I should see the other headers. So see, there's our authorization header that we added. And let's go see the content type. Yep, there's the content type header we added. Okay. So that gets delivered as a header. Now for this body to show up, we need to make some other method other than a GET request. So there's another property called method. Okay, and there's different methods. There's post, you could do delete. Other ones are like put, delete, patch, etc. There's a bunch of different ones. The best way to know them all is to read up on RESTful conventions to learn more about the different types of HTTP verbs. So let me just put a comma here. Okay, and let's try this out and see if that makes a difference. Okay, it's a post method, and see now it recognizes the body. Okay, hello world. Anything, a GET request doesn't recognize the body, everything else does. Put, delete, they all will recognize the body. Okay, so hello world. Okay, so again, these are different places for you to deliver data to an API. So you could deliver data through query string parameters. Again, the query string at the end of the URL. You could deliver data to an API via headers. You could deliver data to an API via a body. But again, a body can only be included in a non-GET request. Okay, and there's also something called a URL param, where they take parts of the URL and make them variables, but that's not something I can emulate right now. Okay, if you go back and learn like something like Express or any kind of backend framework, you'll quickly get familiar with the URL params. Okay, but you can see like there's different mechanisms, there's different spots that you can send information to an API. Okay, usually if you're just tweaking the results, you'll use like a query string. If it's like security reasons or you're specifying what kind of data you're sending over in your body, that's going to be in the headers. And the body is usually like data you're going to add or modify. So if you're adding like a new thing to an API, like you're creating like a new user, that's like a post request. If you're going to update like the user's username, that's generally like a put request. So again, each API is different, but that's sort of the conventions. Okay, so you can see like APIs can get pretty complicated, and this is just like really scratching the surface of all these things you can pass in to these functions. Okay, but now that we kind of saw what the different parts are, let's show you a different way of making this method. So this is Ajax. This requires you to have jQuery, which can be like, you know, you might, if you're using React, Angular, or Vue, you're not going to really be using jQuery in your stuff. So in that case, we may want to use the native built-in way of doing this called fetch. So if I want to make that post, so fetch by default, I could pass it a URL again. Let me grab this URL again. So it's the same story. Okay. The only difference is now is this gets a little bit more complicated with the .thens. You have to do two .thens because the fetch doesn't give you the final result. The fetch gives you sort of this intermediary result. Okay, so the first .then has to go back and like convert the result to something you can use. So the first .then receives the initial response. Again, you can call it whatever you want. And then we need to take that response and then run this JSON function on it. This actually takes that response and turns it to a JavaScript object. This then returns another promise because the .then function returns a promise in case you wanted to do more stuff. So then I have to .then that promise, and this is my final data. Okay, so it's a little bit different than the Ajax. Always that little extra layer kind of confusing, but it's just an extra step. It's always literally the same thing. Okay, but then here I can console.log the data again, so I'm back where I started. And then again, if I want to catch the error, I would put a catch block, put a function there that console.logs the error. Cool. Okay, that console.logs the error. Okay, fetch. Okay, so let's try this out. And see, we get the same thing back. We get the same thing back. Okay, except this time I don't have any query parameters in my URL. I get no body. It's just a normal GET request. Now let's show you how to do the more complicated things in fetch. So in fetch, instead of having to replace this string with an object, you just pass in the object as a second argument. So I just do comma. I actually kind of like this better. Okay, and then here I can then do the same things like method. So we'll say method, we'll do a post. Actually, this time we'll do a put. Okay, and then I can specify headers, and again, headers will be a separate object. And this time we'll just have wacky headers. Cheese. This time it's going to be Munster. Okay. And then we'll have a body. And here, the body is just called body. That's another reason why I like fetch, because the body is just called body. Okay, and then again, I still got to stringify the body. That doesn't change. Okay, and we'll just say hello world is the body, and let's add a query string at the end. So question mark hello equals world. Okay, and then let's go take a look at the result. Okay, so we can see it's a put request. We can see the query string parameter was captured. Hello world. Okay, let's take a look at the headers. Okay, we see there it is, cheese, Munster. See the headers there that we added, and there's the body, hello world. Okay, so very good. That's how fetch works. Okay, it's the same deal. Once you learn how to do it in one of these methods, it's pretty much the same deal in all these methods. It's just like, how do I specify the method? Where do I specify the headers? And if I'm passing in a body, where do I do that? And again, you always got to stringify the body because you're typically sending over JSON data. Good practice is probably, if you're going to send over JSON data, is to make sure you specify the content type header, because sometimes the API will not recognize JSON data without this. Application JSON. You'll type that so much in your developer life, and this should be capital C content and capital T type. And this needs a comma here. And again, for this one, it didn't matter because it picked up on it, but it doesn't always the case. So there it is, content type application JSON. Okay, so like that's a standard one. Like cheese, that's not a standard header. That's just me being funny. Okay. Now the last sort of very popular method for making API calls is Axios. So let's go grab the Axios script tag. Axios script tag. Okay, so right here. I'll scroll through the GitHub, look for the script tag. So using CDN, grab the script tag. Now put that in my header next to my jQuery script tag. Okay, and now I can use Axios. And it kind of works the same way again. Okay, Control C. So we do Axios instead of fetch. And if we just pass in the URL, it's just going to make a basic GET request. The default is always a GET request. Then I do .then, and in this case, you only have to do one .then again. Okay, just like in Ajax. And let's console.log the data. And once again, we want to catch any possible errors. So .catch error. And since I'm only using one parameter, I really don't need those parentheses. So I can just do this console.log error. The beauty of arrow functions, because they allow you to like do little shortcuts like this. So notice I didn't have to use curly brackets. I didn't use parentheses. I was able to just do this. If you want to kind of know all the fun things you can do with an arrow function, watch my video like everything you'd ever want to know about an arrow function, where I show you like all the fun little arrow function tricks. Very awesome. Okay, so that's that. Let's go back here. And see, now the only difference is that Axios doesn't just send you back the data. What it does, it sends you back this object that has all these other things in it. So it tells you all the stuff about the and these are like security configurations. So like some people like Axios because it has some extra security features. It sends you the headers up front. There you go. Request. See, it sends you all this other data, and then the actual data of your request comes in here in the data property. Okay, so then I always have to go like, so the access to console log the actual raw data that I wanted to get back, I have to always do like an extra step and do data.data. That I'm not a huge fan of, but some people really love it. Okay, cool. So now, how do I do all that other fancy stuff in Axios? Axios, if I remember correctly, is going to end up being a little bit more like Ajax, where you pass in an object. So it'll be like URL method. We'll say this time we'll do a delete method. Okay, all these are just the methods themselves don't do anything inherently. The only difference is like get can't take a body. Everything else is the same between all of them. Whether delete is actually used for deleting a thing or put actually used for updating a thing is dependent on whoever makes the API to make those particular requests respond in those particular ways. Okay, headers. Cheese. This time we'll do provolone. Okay, and then last body, but again in Axios, I think it's again a lot like Ajax, where the body is called data. So Json Stringify. I remember that causing me hours of stress once, where I was like wondering like why wasn't my Axios working, and it was because I kept calling it body instead of data. And then again, hello world will be the body. Okay, so there's our Axios call. Let's try it out. Let's refresh, and let's see. Did we get so the body's there? Hello world, because again, Axios takes it, and look, it recognizes it's a delete method. Good. Headers. Do we see Munster? And there's the, well, actually provolone. Yep. So see, it all works. So it doesn't matter whether you're using Axios, fetch, or the Ajax function. You end up in the same place. You're doing the same thing. The main thing is that you are sending a HTTP request to a URL, and you are specifying the method, the headers, the body, adding any queries in the URL that you need to get the result you want. Now, I did mention that I would talk about how you can get around possibly like a CORS error if you want it. So let's do a few things. I'm gonna go back, open that window again. I'm gonna go. What you can do So if I were to go back to my Netlify functions folder, what you would want to do is in your API call or in your Netlify functions function thing, you can actually create because functions happen in the back end. So functions, that's the beauty of Netlify functions. They don't run in the browser, so they're not subject to CORS policy. So what you could do is you can create your own function that makes the API call for you, and then you instead on your front end, like in your actual website, you make an API call to your function, kind of like what we've been doing. And then that function will return the data. So to show you an example, I'm going to make a new folder. So basically the way it works is that there's a folder called Netlify, and there's a folder called functions, and that's where all your functions get created. It's just a folder with an index.js. So I'm going to just do control copy, and then I will paste in the functions. That way there's 2 copies. And I'm going to call the other one, and I'm going to rename it proxy. Because generally when a backend server is basically acting as a middleman between you and an API request, that's referred to it as acting as a proxy. So whenever you hear the word proxy in anything technology-wise, it's always like, this thing is acting as a middleman between these 2 things for whatever purpose. In this case, to avoid CORS errors. Also, to kind of hide sensitive data. The cool thing is, in your Netlify functions, you could do API calls so that way your credentials aren't exposed on the front end. And you can use Netlify environmental variables to hide the data even further. So it's really, really sweet. Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to do is in this proxy, I'm going to change this. And the cool thing is you can install node libraries in your repo. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to, so let me open this terminal. And I'm going to install npm install node fetch. Because here's the thing, well, fetch is built into your front end code, so I was able to use fetch in that HTML file without a problem, without having to like load another script tag. Fetch doesn't exist in the world of Node, your backend JavaScript. So if you want to use Axios or Node or Ajax, all 3 of them have to be installed. To install fetch in the backend, you use a library called node fetch, which is just basically they rebuilt fetch in Node. So npm install node fetch. I want to install that. Okay. And see now in this package.json, node fetch is installed. Okay. And now I will upload this updated version of the template so that way this is kind of already there. And you can just kind of use this proxy function. But basically now what I can do is I go back to this the index.js for my new function. And okay, and then I want to keep those there. But let's say I want to turn off the publicness of this one. Okay, so that one's no longer going to be available to the public. So that would get a CORS error for that one. But what I will do in here is, let me think about this. Well, this is an async function, so that's fine. So then what I want to do is, first I need to bring in fetch. So I have to import fetch. So const fetch equals require. So in Node, this is how you bring in libraries. So once it's installed in the package.json, then I just assign that library to a variable. So node fetch. So node fetch gets stored in fetch. And now I can use it. And I'd first do this, const response. I'm going to use since this function, like your Netlify functions are always async, I can use what's called the async await syntax to make this even prettier. So const response equals await fetch. And let me go grab this URL. Okay, it's got to be a string. And then I can do like const data equals await response.json. So this does the same thing as the API calls I did before, except when you do asynchronous operations in an async function, I can use this await syntax, which is a little bit cleaner looking. So this is the same thing as me saying, hey, fetch, then dot then, response.json, .then, and then I get the data. It's the same thing. Okay. I could also have just written it with the .thens, but this tends to be a little bit more straightforward in this situation. Okay, so then I have the data there. And then the body should now be the data. So we assign the body somewhere. Yeah, I already assigned the body. So in this case, what I want is the body to be Json dot stringify. And then I want to stringify the I'm already stringifying this object, so I don't need to do that. Actually, I don't need any of this because that's the body. So body, I want to JSON.stringify data, and I want to wait for the data to be available. So we're going to say await data, so that way it waits for this data to have been received. That's the cool thing about, again, async functions. Instead of using .thens, I can just use this keyword await, and it does the same thing that .then does. It says wait till the thing is done. Okay, and there we go. So now this function is making that API call for me, and I make an API call to this function, and it should deliver me the data and avoid the CORS errors. So let's try this out. Let me just read here. Anything else I want to do? Okay, fine. I think we're good. So pushy update origin main. Okay. So let's go double check that I finished building. So that's building. Doing all the things. Okay, good. And let's just see if they recognize the extra function. Functions, and there we go. So we see proxy.index got picked up on, so we're good. And functions, and I can see proxies there now. So let me get the URL for proxy, and let's go back to our practice HTML. I just put this URL there for a second. Now I should be getting a CORS error when I do the original practice URL. So let me just see here. Refresh, and see now I'm getting a CORS error again because I commented out those headers. The CORS headers are no longer there, but I still want to get the result of that API. So luckily I made my proxy function, and my proxy function will make the API call from the backend and avoid the CORS errors and then return me the data. So if I do this, okay, then I hit refresh. Okay, see, this time I get a successful call. Now let's take a look. Now notice it says HTTP method get, although if we go back over here, I sent over a delete request. So why does it say get? Because this isn't the request that ended up at that other place. Technically, proxy made the request, and then when I take a look at the proxy request, okay, the proxy is just doing a default fetch, which is going to make it a get. So basically what's happening is proxy is making the request. So my practice function is just returning the data based on that request, and then proxy is returning that over. Like, again, that's usually not an issue, because usually your APIs don't just return you data based on what you just sent over. But the idea is you could create, what you're doing is you make your API calls from here, really your proxy, and then you just call your proxy so you can get the data. And see, I avoid the CORS errors. I'm getting the result of that other function, avoiding the CORS errors without having to manipulate the other API. I can just be like, okay, well, fine, I'm going to get around your CORS errors by creating a proxy server. And that's the deal there. So that might seem, depending on where you're at right now in your developer journey, that might seem a little complicated, but trust me, if you come back to this video down the road, this is going to make a lot of sense and be like, oh, that's actually really cool. Netlify functions are awesome. And yeah, but that's it. This should give you sort of a pretty good idea of how to make API calls with Ajax, Fetch, and Axios. Also how to practice, just making different like types of requests, sending headers, and all that stuff. So my name is Alex Merced. Again, I will post a link to that repo in the video description. Have a great day and enjoy.